once law is made, and once we're analyzing the law, we are at the cemetery already. We're in the coffins, and the battles have taken place in other places. They may even still be taking place, and if we remain in the coffin as we try and think about how we build a world where there's fewer people in coffins, that work is important. But I think you are right that anti-racist praxis requires that we exit the place where power keeps the bodies buried and where it kind of concentrates the regime, and we go and learn about the world outside. And I think it is not an accident that um, legal knowledge production and legal education has intentionally left out those ways of understanding and seeing the world. I think it's part of the structuring of a colonial or an imperial world order where you break knowledge up in those ways. So to me, interdisciplinarity is absolutely crucial, and it is just about ways of knowing and seeing. And I count as part of that interdisciplinarity, not just academics, but connecting with, insofar as is possible, movements or non-academics who are also engaged in the anti-colonial world making.
Tendayi, it's great to see you again. Thanks a lot for being here today. And we're delighted to talk with you then a little bit about race, international law, and anti-racist praxis. And of course, I brought that word up 3 times already. And I'm bringing it up because race is certainly a kind of thematic forefront of your work. Not just as special rapporteur, but then also as a legal scholar, also as potentially schoolactivist, if you use the same language that Chepo does. So I'm wondering if you can help us situate this current moment then, because we're probably about 18 months, if not 2 years away from your final report as special rapporteur. You've made this move, you've switched institutions, and you are now continuing to take forward that struggle. But we notice that the struggle is fighting back. There's almost this counter revolution of sorts underway. So I'm wondering if you can walk us through a little bit this current moment and you yourself and how you find yourself navigating this current moment.
Thank you so much, Mohsen and Claire, for having me. It's really a pleasure to be joining your podcast. And you're starting with easily the hardest question that you could put to an interviewee, and I appreciate that. We're here to discuss the difficult things. It's difficult. It's difficult to say, and maybe what would be productive is to walk you through what I've been walking through rather than to describe where I've arrived. So when I ended my mandate in um, 2022, it had been intensive. When I got into the role of special rapporteur, I think, unlike many others, I don't think I'd fully understood exactly what it was going to be. And it was striking in a number of respects. But one thing is that the racial justice uprisings of 2020 occurred while I was in my mandate. And that was definitely a flashpoint. And it felt as though globally, transnationally, we were at a moment of inflection and potentially shifting the global conversation around race and racism. Come 2022, as I was exiting the mandate, we all who have been active in anti-racism work, I think, thought the events of 2020 created an opportunity, but by no means was everything said and done. And by 2022, already we were feeling the door closing. And by the door closing, I mean an anti-racist backlash or backlash against racial justice initiatives. I'm based in the United States, and it was very palpable in the United States. It was palpable transnationally. And I would argue that the moment we are in right now is not unrelated to both what was achieved in 2020, but also the backlash to it. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But coming out of my mandate, I definitely felt cautiously optimistic about being able to build on some of the developments that I felt had occurred. Also happy to discuss those. Um, and yet we find ourselves in a world that I don't think any of us could have anticipated would have been the case for a number of reasons. Perhaps most saliently for the international system is the Israel-Palestine conflict and the way that that's just reverberated through the international system. So to come back to your question, my goal when I left the mandate was to think about ways of continuing to shift knowledge production around racial justice and fighting for racism within the global system, thinking about ways of ensuring that knowledge production from social movements that are fighting against racism continues to shake up the global forum and take up space and use that as a platform for further change. That was my orientation. We find ourselves now in a moment where we cannot take the global system for granted, even if we ever could. And I find myself, instead of only thinking about, international law and racism, or international law and or the global system and racism, I'm thinking about the very nature of the global system as well, and what it means to engage with it and to fight for it, even as one understands it as a truly a site that is inflected by the same imperial forces that we're fighting outside. And so this is all to say that in a moment where we are confronted with images of intensive suffering, not only in Palestine and Israel, but in other parts of the world, whether we're talking about Sudan, whether we're talking about the US-Mexico border, there is the intensity of the personal suffering and the sense of emergency. There's also the sense of the international system being under siege and being a critic of that system and kind of grappling with all of that. And at the same time, trying to figure out how one keeps an eye on the longue durée. And this is something that seems as an aside, but part of my academic work now has me reading about the colonization of Southern Africa, which is where I'm from. So the initial moment when the British South Africa Company is being formed and is basically rolling out its plan for imperial domination in the region. And racial terror is at the heart of that. And it's a powerful reminder that this moment feels singular in its intensity, but that would be a misread of what's taking place. This battle always has been an incredibly violent and brutal one. And I think it's important to remember that, to have this sense of urgency, but also to keep this sense that we are dealing with what we always have been dealing with.
So there's a couple of things there that I'd like us to build upon. I appreciate that idea of the longue durée. Then you saying that. I appreciate you connecting it with the past, and the brutality of the regime is something that is continual, that is consistent, and that some often feel is perpetual. Now, I'm also appreciate that point that you made about the doors closing, and I recall you in fact saying this a couple of years ago at another event. And I heard you say that. I think you used the metaphor of the window at the time. And what I found, uh, so what I find fascinating about that is how prescient you were. And your reading of the situation was certainly better than my own, in that I thought, oh, that's surprising. Tendayi is unusually cynical. And yet, you had it was a sort of, hammer on the nail moment. How did you pick up on this a couple of years ago? Because I don't know how prominent the backlash was. Because again, this was just shortly after 2020, and this was shortly after Me Too and Black Lives Matter and so on. There was already so much momentum building around this sort of anti-racist movement, around racial justice causes, and we seem to be having some success in that regard. And then you kind of came up with that warning a couple of years ago. How did you predict that then?
Yeah. So, it's kind of you to say that you think I was prescient, and I imagine there are others who intuited this, but I think there's a number of factors, and I also want to disaggregate two levels at which the window or the door is closing. We might think about the forces that we are fighting against, the economic, political, legal forces that kind of the actors in power and the institutions in power. And definitely I had a sense that the openness that we were experiencing, whether we're talking about in the UN system, whether we're talking about in bilateral engagements with the UN member states, that the openness to having a different kind of conversation about racial justice would diminish. And I'll talk a little bit about why I saw that coming. But there was also another sense in which I suspected the window would close, which is that 2020 was a moment of, I think, it felt like a transnational transnational movement, a popular movement, in the sense that publics in different parts of the world seemed engaged in this question of how do we think and even talk about racial justice? What does it look like? And it truly was transnational. There's sometimes things that take place in the global north that we call global or transnational that are not. But I really maintain that 2020 was a shift that we can think of as transnational and global. And even then, in the sense of a kind of popular moment where there is consciousness raising around racial justice, I saw a window closing there. And I would say that the latter, the popular one, is perhaps the one that was more important, and is the one that now I feel most anxious about what it would mean to get back to a moment where you can build a transnational popular kind of consciousness around racial justice as a global challenge. To get back to your question on what made it foreseeable, to my mind, is that 2020, to my mind, was a demand both for reparations and for decolonization. It wasn't a demand, I think, for just, let's have apologies or let's do better about fighting racism. The critique was, we're living in a global order and in legal orders that remain fundamentally structured by colonial hierarchies. And the meaning of Blackness in the US, in Europe, and China is still structured by the transatlantic slave trade and the meaning of Blackness that was kind of initiated in that time. And so, to my mind, the demands were anti-colonial. They were for reparations in the most structural way, which entails shifting wealth, redistributing wealth, actually challenging power, and remaking, in fact, undoing and then remaking nation states, global systems. That's the ask. That was, to my mind, the ask that was the most striking and interesting. And power never gives itself up. It just never does. And I think we saw gradually an appropriation of the language, an appropriation of the demands to make them more palatable for capital in particular. There were all of these corporate initiatives, all of these sorts of things that metabolized the core of the demands that I think got people out on the streets in 2020. And so that I saw coming. We can have a conversation about what it meant for international law and for lawyers in particular. That's something that I'm thinking about now. What is this moment for an international lawyer, given everything that being an international lawyer entails? But to my mind, the nature of the demand signaled that there was not going to be a peaceful, kind of, we're going to go along and we will keep going until we get to the end of this road. I anticipated a backlash and a need to continue to fight and to push and so on.
So in other words, then, and this is just the final one that I'll ask on this, what we see today then was inevitable because of the demands then that we were making towards racial justice, including the anti-colonial demands, including the reparations demands. We effectively knew this was coming. Then was the point.
I think that we could anticipate that a backlash was coming, but its details and the front lines, I think, I definitely don't think that would have been the case. And I think different parts of the world are amenable to different kinds of analyses. Again, because I'm in the US right now, there is a way in which I think the current moment, where the moment we might think of, or the current period, involves, a Trump presidency and a complete, kind of a shift to an overtly fascist regime. I don't think that was inevitable. I think there were definitely moves that were made that could have taken us in a different direction. But I want to point out that a lot of the most intensive forms of backlash were present even under the prior administration, right? So the backlash was there. We were always, and by we, I just mean people who are invested in an anti-colonial world-making project. We could always understand that there was going to be backlash. It was already taking place. The precise forms, I think, are different, and I think our own preparedness to sustain momentum in the face of them is also something that we might discuss.
I was wondering if we could return to what you were saying, and you were happy to talk about, which is what does this moment mean then for us as international lawyers who are committed to effectively anti-racism and anti-colonial struggle, particularly in the light of Palestine. As you were talking, I was thinking about, why hasn't the last year kind of garnered the global consciousness that 2020 garnered? And yeah, reflecting a little bit on what this means for international lawyers, what it means for the international architecture that a lot of people put a lot of trust and hope in. And then for a lot of us, I think, who are more jaded, like myself, understand the need for some form of international architecture, but perhaps not in the way that it is currently not operating, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, and I think one thing I'd like to put on the table is that even the we, when we think about, and I just said, the we I'm talking about is those of us who are invested in an anti-colonial world-making project. To my mind, one of the things that's revealed in the current moment is that we even so if we say we as people who are invested in this anti-colonial world making project, there is a way that unifies the group and projects on it a kind of coherence, both of commitment and strategy and tactics, that I think we are seeing has come under pressure in this moment. And I think that even in 2020, when there was serious momentum to build a kind of transnational movement fighting against racism, popular, and even, I would say, even among international lawyers, I wouldn't say that we invested as much work in trying to really understand um, uh, coalitions of anti-racism as themselves requiring work to build, right? So race and racialization, I think, for sure have generalizable patterns that we can describe, but the conditions confronting Black people in the United States are different from the conditions confronting Black people in Kenya, and are different from the conditions confronting other non-white groups in different parts of the world. And even the meaning of whiteness in different parts of the world will shift. And part of what that means is that in this moment, for example, when you have different kinds of groups that are invested in anti-racism, we have to be thinking about anti-Black racism. We have to be thinking about Islamophobia. We have to be thinking about anti-Palestinian racism, even within the coalitions that understand themselves as opposed or, committed to anti-colonial world making. So the first point is to say that I think that where we find ourselves is a moment of realizing that the work is outside and inside, and that inside and outside work is really critical. I want to say something to speak about international lawyers in particular. I want to say something about whiteness, right? And here I want to be clear that I'm thinking about whiteness in structural terms, which of course is embodied. There are individuals who are racialized as white, and as you and your listeners will know, the majority of the international law bar in different parts of at least the global north is whites, and even in parts of the global south is. International law, to my mind, is an elite practice, and elite practices lead to elite communities kind of dominating them. And this, I think, also says something about the non-white people who are also participating in international law. But I would say that irrespective of the individual racializations of people, there is a way in which our field as international law, our methods, our approach to the problem have been fundamentally structured by a commitment to a global white supremacist project, right? If you read Anthony Angi's book and you think about the critique of positivism that he has, which associates it with a project that is kind of invested in or critical to bifurcating sovereignty in a way that is racialized. Positivism is how most of the world of international lawyers do their work. And in that move alone, you have a kind of approach to the work that, to my mind, entrenches the colonial dimensions of the system that we are fighting against, and the white supremacist dimension of what we are fighting against. And I think we are in a moment of realizing just how how much on the back foot that leaves us in some ways. And so this is not a very well articulated set of thoughts. And I'm actually finding that I don't even remember the precise question that you asked me. But it's just to say that when we bring the question to where we are as international lawyers, the questions are so deep and so many, and it's the same ones, by the way, that we've been asking all along. But I think many of us who have been thinking in these ways are just stunned to realize just how accurate the analysis was, and just how urgent the need to fight it is, and how under-resourced in many ways we are to do so.
That Mosen and I are just sitting here nodding our heads as you are, in effect, talking about methodological whiteness, right? Because it's a conversation that he and I have quite often about kind of when we think about, the epistemology of international law, just how white it is in terms of structural terms and the depth that that whiteness goes to not only the epistemology but the ontology and even the methods that we use, and how one begins to unpack that is.
For sure. And Claire, I just want to say something, and I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go,
I
please.
want to give an example that is outside of the global north, because sometimes, again, and I experienced this in my mandate, where people were like, you are based in the US, you're bringing a kind of not a white, a US sensibility around race to bear on a global conversation. And I do want to concede that there can be imperial tendencies in different kinds of methods, and being based in the US, and the kind of even the methods of critiquing race that have dominated here, there's no reason why they may not kind of take on an imperial bent, in the sense of kind of leveling other ways of critiquing race in other parts of the world. But I want to give the example of a case that was decided in a court, in a tribunal in Southern Africa. So this is the Southern African Development Communities Tribunal that was deciding a land reform case. This was following land seizures in Zimbabwe by the Mugabe regime, and they were violent and problematic in many ways. But the case was brought by a group of white farmers who argued that the seizure of land from white farmers was racially discriminatory, right? So it was deciding on the question of racial discrimination, and the court essentially found that because the program, or the program that was in place, because it disproportionately targeted white farmers, it was racially discriminatory. It reached that decision in a region where land ownership, as many people will know, was colonially structured. So prior to 1980, Black people were excluded from owning vast majority of Zimbabwe's land, such that the only way to achieve land reform is to undo the racial injustice, which requires race-conscious methods. When you read the decision that got the tribunal to decide that it was racially discriminatory, what you see in there is a kind of colorblind, methodology that ends up entrenching a white supremacy in the region. And the tribunal judges were not white judges, right? And it's that kind of understanding of a methodological whiteness, or a commitment to a kind of a racial order that preserves the interests of white settlers in Southern Africa to the present, that I think we are grappling with. And it's bringing this kind of nuance to how we think and talk about race that is really that is, I think, is really crucial. And I know that both of you are also invested in your own work.
So there are two things that came to mind as you were speaking. The first one was a quote from Charles Mills, where he says, "White ignorance is not limited to white people." And then the second one is the title to Christopher Geevers' article that was published, actually, I think in the UCLA Law Review, Unwhitening the World. And really interesting then that language, to play with it. Obviously, he's building on Du Bois there, right?
Mm-hmm.
This idea of then the white world, and that idea of unwhitening the white world. Now, to bring it back to international lawyers, and I'm going to speak for myself here, who've been engaging in these various circles that you're referring to, these elite circles, and trying to push this sort of anti-racist then praxis for a number of years. And I recall one moment where I was at the University of Auckland, and I was the lecturer representative on the hiring panel. And we were talking about this hiring round that we had coming up, and they said they wanted to focus on a professor, and they said, well, let's make sure then that we diversify, and we should really right, favor female professors. This was the conversation that was happening. And that was the understanding of diversify. The diversify was purely gender-wise. Now, of course, if you looked around the room, you did have a couple of Maori colleagues, and then you had myself, and then you had everything else that you just described. Now, I pointed out and I said to them, I said, how about we hire a black woman? And I recall that moment, and it wasn't just the pin dropped, it was their realization that diversity to someone who was non-white didn't mean the same as what it meant to someone who was white. And in fact, two of the colleagues lodged a complaint against me afterwards with the dean because I used that word black. And I said specifically we should hire a black woman. And afterwards, I needed to have a conversation with the dean. I needed to have a conversation with the vice dean about then ways of negotiating these spaces in manner that doesn't make colleagues uncomfortable. And of course, you can appreciate then the language that they used. They did say to me that I came across as very angry. So what I put to you then, and that's the question that we come to here, what I put to you is that how much success have you enjoyed then, or have you enjoyed any success in pushing this anti-racist praxis within these type of white spaces? Have your efforts helped in terms of maybe not unwhitening the world, but maybe unwhitening our world, in unwhitening our academy? Do you find these spaces, and again, thinking about you being in the US, which some might say is the epicenter of the backlash or the white lash or however you want to term it, have you found it that it's been amenable? You have your network, and we're aware of that. But the spaces that we inhabit and the spaces that we're trying to transform go far beyond our network.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is a hard question. All the questions are hard, but this one is tough, and I can think of at least three spheres that are responsive to your question. And in each one, I think that my own, because you're asking me about my own personal role, which I think is we should all be asking these questions of each other. There's my work in the UN, and you might ask a question about whether within the UN itself, which suffers from the exact same forms of racialization as we're discussing in the academy, where when I think about my staff when I was at the UN, and many of them were amazing individuals, when I think about the Office of Special Procedures, and I think about who's in what role, the racialized nature of those structures is profound, and that was part of the conversation in 2020 and thereafter, where there's things that cannot share because I was committed to confidence, but just what felt to me like really basic ways of thinking and understanding about what race and racialization were highly controversial. So this I can share: conversations around anti-blackness and naming anti-blackness as a form of racism within the UN was sometimes really difficult because of this idea that racism is racism. And if you're going to talk about anti-blackness, is that not a racist move? It's, just like that kind of analysis I want to flag as having been salient, and as, not being the kind of monolithic context in which one operated in the UN, but it was definitely present. And I would like to think that some of the advocacy that I was engaged in the UN helped at least identify that as a problem. But I will be honest with you, changing institutions requires investing in institutions. And when I was in my mandate, I definitely did not prioritize investing in the UN as the institution I was most committed to kind of transforming in the time that I was there. So I think others have committed time to that project. It's a project that I think is really worthwhile, but I think you have to be of a different disposition than my own to do that. And we can talk about what kind of disposition that entails. So that's one space. And then when I think about the US, I think about two spaces. There's the field of international law, perhaps kind of ASIL sits at the peak of that, the American Society of International Law, and then there's my own law school environment. And I'll focus to talk about ASIL just because we are an international law podcast. I think that within the American Society of International Law, there have been people who have worked incredibly hard to fight against the racialization of the institution internally, including people like Henry Richardson, for whom a report was named that actually studied the relationship between the American Society of International Law and non-white members, and in particular, not just non-white members, but also domestic people who are Americans who are non-white. And again, I think this speaks to the way that race and racialization and racial exclusion work differently depending on your nationality. And so people like Henry Richardson, people like James Scotty, people like Anthony Angie, and people who've mobilized under the um, BASIL is the name of the group within ASIL, I think have done really powerful work to push the American Society of International Law to grapple with racialization as a structuring feature in the present. I think my own role in that has been minimal relative to what other people have done. But I think those battles are really complicated, right? They take a lot of time, they take a lot of energy, they take a lot of investment. And as we all know, people who are invested in fighting for racial justice, there are ways in which initiatives that seek to transform are appropriated in ways that mean that they just become a part of the landscape, and yet another feature that the association can kind of highlight as a positive feature about it without there necessarily being the kind of deepest transformation. I also want to highlight that I think some of the people that have been instrumental for seeing the kinds of shifts that we've seen at the American Society of International Law, whether it's membership of the American Journal of International Law's board of editors, whether it's just content, what references are there to race and racialization in the American Journal of International Law. The progress that has been made on that front has also been as a result of white members of the society understanding their own whiteness as implicated in the conversation. And I think that we always have to insist that this is a project of kind of shifting power. So I think there've been meaningful changes, but it really comes down to the bigger question, which we will get to, which is, what are we fighting? What do we think is the end goal? What do we think success looks like? To my mind, an international law association will never be an anti-colonial world-making space. Those things are inherently contradictory. The American Society of International Law will always be a site at which the battle for anti-colonial world making must be fought, but it will never be where it is won. And when, quote unquote, when we are approaching the kind of world we are all seeking, the association would be remaking itself into something that, to my mind, would be unintelligible to us in the moment now. So I am less invested in a kind of valorization of a transformed, say, American Society of International. And I hate to keep picking on ASIL. I'm just giving a concrete example, which is one that I'm involved in. I'm less invested in kind of valorizing some perfect destination that it will reach in its current form, and more invested in treating it as a site of contestation that cannot be ceded. And this is how I think about international law more broadly as well.
So a quick follow-up and then hand over to Claire. No, just because there's just something I wanted to pick on. Just really this one thing.
It's my turn. I've got two things.
Okay, so I'm going to pick on one quickly.
Okay, you're ruining my flow. Go for it.
So you're not invested in transforming the UN, and you're not invested in transforming ASIL. So what are you invested in transforming?
So here's
and
the
what
thing.
is your fronts?
Yeah. Okay.
Where are you putting your attention?
These quotes are going to start floating around, and it's going to be like, you said you're not in. I think what I'm trying to communicate by that is, I think there are people, and we need these people. These people are essential, who are institutionalists. And I myself feel as though, the personal successes that I've had, the ways I'm able to think and talk about international law, which cannot be taken for granted. It's a huge amount of privilege to be a critical international lawyer who's doing anti-racism work, who, has the job where I have the job and is moving through these spaces. It's a deep privilege. And it is only because they are institutionalists, anti-racist institutionalists, who have fought the battles in all of these institutional places to make it so that somebody like me could be present. So when I say I'm not invested in like fighting for the UN as an institution, I'm not trying to denigrate those who are. We need them. I'm just making a point about my own personality. And it maybe perhaps it's flaws. But you're right in saying, okay, so what are you invested in? I am invested in the fight. I am invested in the unmaking, in the kind of the resistance and the challenge to a colonial world order. And because I find law really fascinating, like I think international law is just a really intriguing artifact. That is the site that I have chosen. But what gets me out of bed isn't the sense that they will be we will win over the UN or we will win over ASIL. What gets me out of bed every morning is if I'm interested in a kind of anti-colonial way of being, that entails pushing for X and Y in a myriad of institutional spaces, and that's what motivates me. Does that make sense?
So I know you said you were going to focus on ASIL because of international law, but I am genuinely curious in how you take that all forward in your kind of pedagogical approach, right? In many ways, law schools are the microcosm of everything that we've talked about. And so I'm very curious about how you turn up and pursue bringing about an anti-colonial world in that environment.
Yeah.
Another easy question.
I know you guys really rolling with the easy questions. So I will start off by saying that I'm actually not teaching this year, for which I'm profoundly grateful, only because I think that the time that we are in is forcing me to really kind of rethink and try and recalibrate who I am in the classroom. And teaching means a lot to me. In many ways, I think they're the most precious dimension of the work that we do is the work that we do in the classroom. And it is a site of world making, because if we are doing our jobs as international law professors, we are reproducing the coloniality of the world order, right? Like that's what I was actually just, thinking about what we teach, how we teach the cases and what we do. Like the baseline thing you are doing as an international lawyer, if you're just doing your job, is you're not doing anti-colonial world making, you're doing colonial world making, right? So that's like the baseline from which all of us are starting. And I think in general, I have tried in the classroom to resist that in different ways. There is a way in which my very presence in the classroom feels like at the beginning of a resistance, right? And we can talk about what that means. But it's kind of operates at multiple levels. It's the substance of what I'm teaching, and I've been fortunate to have a teaching package that includes an international human rights clinic where we're actually engaging in human rights praxis. And I think praxis is the best way to be true to the kinds of goals that we have in a pedagogical context, because our students want to know about the practice of law and they're invested in kind of how you do that. So having a teaching in the clinic, I think, is the place where I felt like pedagogically I was able to best embody and communicate the anti-colonial world making sensibilities that I was committed to, both because we considered doctrine, but we considered also its application to real world contexts where you're trying to bring about the kind of change that we're talking about. I could go into detail into what some of that looked like. This was not always easy. My first law school class that I taught was first year property law to students who want to pass the bar. They just want to know what property law is. The very first case we read is Johnson v. McIntosh, which is the case that essentially establishes the right to property in this country, which is about indigenous dispossession. And even the language of the case is the most kind of racist, not most racist or racialized, the most explicitly so. And it basically professes the nature of what property rights are and the property regime that the nation is based on. But when I first taught that class, I was straight out of getting my first job, nervous about all of the things. And when I think about how I taught that class, there was nothing anti-colonial world making about that. And if I ever go back to teaching property, I'm going to have to rethink this. So all of this is to say, I have the privilege, I think now, of teaching subject matter that I can, because of what people like you all are writing. There is like a canon of anti-colonial international law texts, and I'm teaching courses where I can bring these in, that makes it easier. And also, I think there's a self-selection that's happening. I've been fortunate enough to teach in contexts where my students are really eager for this knowledge. I actually find the greatest pushback comes from other colleagues rather than students. But that's not the case for everybody. I think there are people who are teaching in contexts where to take that approach is to be kind of in a position of tension with your students because of what they expect you to be teaching and who they expect you to be. So it's all to say that I feel really fortunate to have taught in contexts where this is the dynamic. The thing that breaks my heart is most of my teaching is in the US, and I'm really trying to rearrange my life so that I'm teaching more in Southern Africa in particular, which is where I'm from, and where again, even in the parts of the world that are the subject of kind of the mobilization, the way we teach reproduces the very structures we're supposed to be fighting against.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question to that final point you made about teaching then in Southern Africa. And I ask this question, being aware then of myself and where I've taught and the conversations I've had with colleagues between those who are teaching in First World, Global North, and those who are teaching in the Third World, Global South, and such. And what they found, and this is where it's almost the truth to what Charles Mill said, the white ignorance is not limited to white people. They and I have found it difficult to bring in canons such as Twale, right, or CRT, or even that idea of anti-Black or anti-Palestinian racism into the lecture theatre in the Third World. And that is where I start to wonder, not so much in terms of how receptive are those spaces, but the kind of damage that colonialism has done and the depths of the internalization of those colonial logics, right, of that colonial episteme. And so I bring this question then to the issue of epistemology here. And I wonder then, the epistemology that we have in the Third World, or the epistemologies that we have in the Third World, many of them have been shaped by that colonial experience. And some have gone in the direction of anti-colonial praxis. And yet others, particularly within the institutions, have gone in the direction of embracing colonialism, right, writ large.
Yeah.
And so when you say that teaching property law or teaching what we're teaching, we're not contributing at all to anti-colonialism, quite the opposite. We're contributing to that colonial making process. Well, many of the students want precisely that. And so they end up being violent spaces in their own way.
Yeah.
In silencing then those other universals, the other universals, many of which originate within those spaces where we happen to be.
Yeah. 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 No, I mean, I think this is right. And I think, when we think about race and racialization, I often say these are globalized technologies, and they are structuring the world globally. And it means that even when you think about when you think about race and racialization in different parts of the world, not only is there an urgency for a critique of a kind of global white racial project, there's also the need for a critique of the different ways that racialization has reproduced itself over the centuries since, say, formal decolonization, in a way that means there has to be an attentiveness to post-colonial racializations and the way that knowledge production around them, I think, serves the purposes of entrenching again like a kind of global white supremacist order, and also masking that as it's happening, right? So I think that's definitely a place to start from. But I think that in terms of the practical question that you're asking, and I can relate to everything that you're describing, I think there's a number of things we have to confront. I know in my own work, I'm really coming back to my theory of the post-colonial state and really grappling with what it means to see the post-colonial nation state for what it really is, which is an institutional mechanism that continues to produce coloniality in a myriad number of forms. So me as an international lawyer, when I arrive with my anti-colonial, I'm doing it in a context of an institutional environment that you are pushing against, and where resistance to that kind of resistance to the post-colonial state is barely, it's in academic spaces, is not necessarily potent or live, right? And that's really the challenge. It's your students want one thing because their subjectivities are constructed to understand success in a particular way. I don't mean this in a condescending way. All of our subjectivities are being constructed by the world around us, but by the time you get somebody who's a law student, chances are they're very ambitious, very bright, they're success oriented, and of course that typically lends itself to being kind of as close to kind of the power arrangements as possible. So I think all of this is to say we all need to be doing a number of things. I know for my own self what this means is, with respect to Southern Africa, being invested in a political landscape that is trying to challenge the post-colonial nation state as a normalized kind of vehicle of self-determination when it isn't. So there's a political project there that implicates us as international lawyers. And then I think another thing is also shifting how we present the arguments that we're trying to make, right? And producing the knowledge in ways that takes as a starting point the context in which the people who we are teaching are steeped in, right? So the syllabus that I have for teaching third world approaches to international law that I teach in the US, if I'm going to teach that class in South Africa, or if I'm going to teach that class in Zimbabwe, it behooves me to reframe and seek materials that can start the conversation in a way that doesn't frame the initial move as one that seems so foreign to anything that my students will have kind of experienced and understood. And in some realms, it's easier than in others, right? So I work on migration, and I think that, understanding the racialization and the coloniality of international migration is, people in the third world everywhere, that is a lived experience. We don't have to go very far. Like, the materials on that topic are directly related. But when it comes to property, for example, right? Like, if I teach Mackinton v. Johnson v. McIntosh, which is the US case, I think I'll get a very different response than if I teach In Re Southern Rhodesia, right? Which is the case that comes out of the British Privy Council and is deciding on whose title can be recognized in what becomes Zimbabwe on the basis of race. I would imagine teaching that might get a different kind of reaction. So anyway, it's all to say that I think that two things: the battle we are fighting is a much deeper one. It's a truly deep one. And then on the other side, I think we can also work to do the work differently. And I think the challenge is, it's like a handful of us doing this work in all of these different contexts, and we're just human.
So I guess the point that I want to pick up on is kind of the limitations of law in, well, the limitations of law in creating an anti-colonial world. And I know throughout your work, you've talked about kind of the need for imperfect action. And if we think about the fact that, one, there is a very limited number of us doing this work, and two, we are only human, what is the imperfect actions that we should be taking, apart from teaching the work differently? I can't remember the phrase you used very early on in the conversation, but where do you see the traction with the windows closing, with this kind of unimaginable world that we find ourselves in? I'm very reluctant to say moment, because I feel like at this point, this is our reality. We've been talking about moments for so long that this is what we are working with. And I very much do see the cyclical nature of it, right? And this is where I kind of rely on the anti-racist canon drawn broadly about that cyclical nature. which means that we also have a lot of very smart people telling us how to grapple with these moments, not necessarily as forms of blueprints, but we have kind of the comfort of knowing that others have gone through this before and others will go through it again. So with that in mind, where do you see alternatives or futures? Where does your freedom dreaming lie as we walk towards, hopefully, fingers crossed, good alternative futures, not apocalypse?
Or both, or both.
You can see it. I did say I was jaded.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this is so I have no generalizable answers. I really
Of
think this
course not.
I have no generalizable.
There's no generalizable.
There's
No one
no
is it. No one is
yeah.
expecting a generalizable answer. I promise. That is the last thing we're expecting.
Yeah, there's no generalizable answers. I can answer for myself personally, but there's definitely some things that I think have to be on the to-do list. You know, the liberal world order that we live under has always, and this is the critique I think of Toil and other post-colonial or critical movements, has always already been a kind of an imperial structure, right? And we've, I think, have understood ourselves to be fighting imperialism even in the or imperialisms even in the present. I think we are in a moment where the imperial, the kind of the nature of the imperial project is especially naked, and the tactics feel especially naked in the sense that you have, at least the way I experience the United States, is an imperial hegemon that is, and I think Europe falls in this category as well, willing to expend a fair amount of capital, money, but also kind of normative capital to shore up the settler colonial domination of Palestinians. Like this is a moment that we are in, and this is not a new dynamic, I think, but the register in which this is taking place and the kind of levels of brutality have crescendoed in ways that mean that debates that we were having before, where we needed to make the move between why what's happening, counts as imperialism, why does it count as colonial, like we don't even have to go to those difficult moves. Like we are in a world right now where we are watching a live stream genocide, and I think any kind of contestation about whether that's genocide is, to my mind, deeply disingenuous, right? There's a gloves off time that we are in, and I think that even in this gloves off time, there is an urgency to continue I think of a lot of the work that academics do is just correcting the record, which is producing knowledge that just says the things that are happening, which can seem really basic, but it's becoming really costly, personally and professionally costly, for people in different parts of the world. And so there's a way in which part of what I think we need to be doing is continuing to do what we've been doing in the past and doing it better, which is um, being forthright about the real world implications of the legal frameworks that we are all engaged in. And that, I think, is grueling work. It has become ever more grueling, and we can't denigrate that. I think we really have to be working to um, build build solidarity, and I don't mean that in a kind of like let's come together and hold hands, but really thinking about what it means to build ways of thinking about and resisting international law that take us out of the siloed frames that we've been using. Your audiences and you all will know that I could think of myself as part of being in the Twale tent and being in the CRT tent, but there are so many other tents, and there's so many ways in which that tent is narrow and parochial because of where we are located, who we speak to. I think the kinds of coalitions that we need to be thinking and acting in the most responsible ways have to be broader and deeper than that. That requires work, but yeah, I don't know. I guess those are some of the things that I'm thinking about. But it is a truly disorienting time, not because it's unexpected, but because all of the things happen that really are true, if that makes sense.
So on that final remark, then, um, So there are 2 points there that I'd like you to conclude on. The first one is about the gloves, and you said the gloves are off. Hmm? There's a part of me that fears that the demand now is just for the gloves to be back on. And I think that's strategic. And certainly, if you create enough chaos, then people cease to ask for justice. All they want is order. And even if that is an unjust order, well, at least I have crumbs to eat, right? So that's the first part there. How do we resist then almost the despair that we feel and that sort of nostalgia for the gloves being back on? Is the first part. Um, and then the second one, then, it's, I suppose I would have to say, does anti-racist praxis in the context of international law require us to escape the law? Is that what is necessary? And I ask this because of your own work, that if we're going to use then, right, this familiar term, is transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, you call upon other registers. We might even say that you call upon other universals then to get us, to provoke us to think differently about the law. So does anti-racist praxis, the kind then of praxis that we need to engage in so that we don't fall back into that liberal trap of putting the gloves on, does that require us then to engage with those alternative registers? Does that require us to engage, to maybe try to build other universals? And does that mean then escaping the international law, that register that we are all committed to?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so on the first question, that's a really insightful point in addition to being a good question. It's very insightful and it's something that I hadn't touched on, but you're absolutely right that there is um, external and internal pressures to ask, as you say, just for the gloves to be back on. And I feel variously about this. Like they are when I think about the UN system, and when I think, for example, about the existence of an international court of justice that is capable of delivering decisions that you know state the law as it is, but in contexts where those statements are just so controversial that having the ICJ, be involved seems to have some benefit to those who are fighting on the ground, and in this case it's, I find myself wanting to defend the ICJ, right? And then to my mind that feels a little bit like, let's get the gloves back on, because the ICJ is by no means a perfect institution that has been on the side of kind of anti-colonial world making by any stretch of the imagination, right? um, but I think that my own position is on this is, insofar as we are engaging in actions that are about the gloves just being on, that kind of action may be necessary to save lives. And I really do believe that saving lives is crucial. And we are talking about, people dying on a scale that is truly horrifying. And I think any work that is geared towards stemming the flow of blood, I think is crucial work, but it is not the only work, and it actually is not the bread and butter of the work that academics do. So I think very few international lawyers are doing the kind of work, to my mind, that is in the category of putting the gloves back on a little bit, that we can say that that work is really important. But I just want to name that I think there are some international lawyers who are in that category, and I think that work is really crucial. I think for international legal scholars, this is the moment to resist that move. And I know I want no part in trying to salvage the gloves on version in a moment where we are seeing that it's the same thing. right? It's the same thing. It's just maybe expanded targets. So I think I value your framing, because I think it is a time to very deeply resist the idea that at least we can get the gloves back on. We have continued to do that. And it is that process of putting the gloves back on that reproduces the structures and the injustices and takes them forward. And I think the onus now is to think with groups that are thinking about how you build solidarity, how you build flourishing, how you maintain resistance in a gloves off world, rather than aligning with groups and momentum that is about how you get the gloves on really quickly. And then the other question was about escaping law, also a really great insight. And you're right that it's definitely a move that I make. And I think it's because, you know, once law is made, and once we're analyzing the law, we are at the cemetery already. You know, we're in the coffins, and the battles have taken place in other places. They may even still be taking place. And if we remain in the coffin as we try and think about how we build a world where there's fewer people in coffins, you know, that work is important. But I think you are right that anti-racist praxis requires that we exit the place where power keeps the bodies buried and where it kind of concentrates the regime, and we go and learn about the world outside. And I think it is not an accident that legal knowledge production and legal education has intentionally left out those ways of understanding and seeing the world. I think it's part of the structuring of a colonial or an imperial world order, where you break knowledge up in those ways. So to me, interdisciplinarity is absolutely crucial, and it is just about ways of knowing and seeing. And I count as part of that interdisciplinarity, not just academics, but connecting with, insofar as is possible, movements or non-academics who are also engaged in the anti-colonial world making. I think we cannot know and see enough if we remain in the small slice of concentrated power that is what international law and law in generally represents. So I think that's, insofar as we have concluding advice, I think, Mohsen, as the interviewer, you've actually, I think, identified the two, which is one, let's not be committed to putting the gloves back on. This is an opportunity to really understand what it might mean to fight on these terms and move forward. And then the other piece is stepping outside of law, I think, is crucial.
Fantastic concluding remarks, Tendayi. So wanted to take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of the listeners, on behalf of the readers of Opinion Juris, on behalf of Claire, on behalf of myself, on behalf of all critical scholars who are inspired by your work. You're a hero to many of us. We look up to you for the work that you do. And I get that this is, you know, kind of one of those moments that can make you feel a little bit sheepish. But again, I think it's important to be said. There are many people around the world, colleagues, students, comrades, who look to your reports, who look to your scholarship, who look to you and say, that is the type then of activist, of scholar that I would like to be. And so we're in admiration of you, we're in awe of you, but most of all, we're in appreciation
You make me
of you.
cry on your podcast. Thank you so much for those. Thank you so much for those kind words, and thanks for the sharp provocations. You know, I could say the same about both of your work, which I think is doing really important work to do the anti-colonial world making that I think we should all be invested in. So thank you for having me, and thank you for your
It's
work.
very kind of you to say. Thank you, then tonight.